Good afternoon on this lovely sunny Thursday. I'd like to, on behalf of Ian O'Hurley, head of our education team, to welcome you to this, our second webinar for post-primary schools, remote education, the legal and technical challenges. I'm joined here by two of my colleagues, Catherine Kelly, who's a senior associate and known to many of you, and also by Paul Rochford, a partner in the education team also. So thanks for joining me, Catherine and Paul. Just to say that we're delighted with so many participants today. We've had to disable our live question facility because of the volume of questions we have received. Also, I'd like to acknowledge and thank other members of the education team, Liam Reardon, Fiona Shield, and of course, Ian O'Hurley himself, for their input in relation to the webinar. And everything we have on our slides today reflects what you have asked of us in relation to the questions, although obviously we couldn't cover every area. Ian O'Hurley will email you later with the slides and a link to the webinar itself. And as a team, we are very conscious that the last week has been one of the most momentous in post-primary education, with the cancellation of the Leaving Cert and the introduction of the alternate grade system and all the challenges that will pose for you as school leaders and your staffs. And we want to wish you well there. We also are aware that your schools are reopening on Monday for essential access for staff. So that'll be another milestone for you too. So we're going to start off firstly with the areas that you have identified as being areas that you would like discussed. And they're broken down into two areas, the management of the school and the principal and staff. And at the outset, I would like to acknowledge that amongst our participants today, we have, of course, mostly school principals and deputy principals, but we have the management bodies and also we have many of the trusts. So it's great to have such collective wisdom with us. So we're going to look at the question of how governance and management continues. Child protection is obviously an area still of concern to you, and rightly so. Your duties as an employer. How have they been affected? And particularly in relation to recruitment. Finally, you have the critical, the teaching part and supporting the learning of students. And then the issue of data protection and security. So I'm going to start straight away with a question. When we look at the governance issues, we see that the department, through the manuals that they have published, allow you to have remote meetings. You're obviously obliged to record the minutes, in your minutes, the fact that it is in a remote setting. And one of the issues that will come up and we'll address later is the issue of confidentiality. You have to be quorate at all times, and the normal preparations must be allowed for the setting of agendas, and equally testing the equipment. And we all have our moments before we come live, even with a webinar like this, that we have our equipment in order. So just one of the questions I'll throw, Paul, at you is, how do I deal with a situation where the signal drops during a remote meeting of the board? And this comes from an understandably anxious chairperson.
Thanks, David, for that. I think, look, boards of management will have been having meetings other than in person in the past. You know, certainly it was envisaged that in emergency situations, they would be done by a conference call, perhaps. So in many ways, it's no different than that. If someone's phone signal dropped, I think what is vital is that people are clear as to what is going to happen. And, you know, in line with all the conduct of these types of meetings now, where we're doing it in a virtual sense, that both the chair in charge of the meeting and also the members of the board understand exactly what's going to happen, so that the meeting can continue to operate smoothly. So if somebody drops out, you know, is there an alternative? Have you got a WhatsApp group or something to try and find out what the issue is? Do you reconnect them? If the person that drops out means you're below a quorum, then obviously you can't continue, and you have to have contingencies for how you're going to deal with that. Or perhaps you still have a quorum and you intend to proceed with your meeting, and you might just notify the person that they can rejoin at a later stage. So I think clarity of expectation amongst board members and for chairpersons, so they know exactly what to do when that happens and it doesn't throw off the meeting too much, is paramount.
So this basically anticipating what might go wrong and having procedures in place rather than being caught off guard. I take it as, you know, a key point that you're putting across there. This leads perfectly into the next question, and that is, what are the ground rules for conducting an online meeting of the board? And there are a number of issues there, and one of them I think would be very sensible would be not to agree to electronic recordings, that each member of the board confirms that they're participating on their own. There isn't another adult in the room. So we're moving from a situation where we have a board meeting within the four walls, and then when a member of the board can be overheard. We're all working from our homes, so this can be challenging, but to maintain the integrity of the meeting, the chairperson should be insisting on these safeguards. Obviously a protocol for speaking, and then the agreed report at the end. So in relation to confidentiality and that, anyone like to make a comment there?
Well, I think, again, you know, having agreed protocols in place, and even though some boards will have been having meetings over the past number of weeks, you know, I may already have addressed some of these. It's not too late to get around this now and get it laid down, because those types of meetings may carry on for a number of weeks and months yet. And things such as, you know, be conscious of security. You know, where are you? Who else is around? Are you using headphones? Are you perhaps doing things like referring to students by pseudonyms rather than mentioning names in the live conference? So, you know, just being conscious of the fact that you're not operating in a normal scenario. And I know that Catherine is a member of the board and has live experience of this, so she may have some thoughts on this herself.
Yeah, I'm on the board of a secondary school, and we've had a number of board meetings since this all started via Zoom, and we've had no issues at all. They've all run very, very well, the same way as we would when we have face-to-face meetings, but obviously confidentiality is key there, and also keeping a record of keeping the normal minutes of that meeting.
And speaking of that, I think it leads into our next question, which is in relation to child protection. And I'll direct this question to Catherine. And it's child protection hasn't gone away. What is the role of the principal stroke DLP in relation to a child protection oversight report? Catherine.
Well, yes, of course, the child protection guidelines still apply in a general way, but at the moment there is no child protection oversight report that needs to be given to the board. The principal needs to keep records and all of the documentation in relation to any child protection concern, however, until the next face-to-face meeting, whenever that will happen. And the board is responsible for making sure that this is done.
So thanks for that. And speaking of the responsibility of the board, we will look at the role of the board as an employer. The next question here is, how can a board be expected to promote health and safety when staffs are working remotely from home? I think it's a fair question, isn't it?
It is a fair question, but we always have to remember that the board is the employer of staff, and therefore has a duty of care towards all of the employees. And that doesn't change just because they're working remotely from home. So it is a stressful time for a lot of employees, and they have a lot of challenges, and therefore we would always advise that you keep in regular contact with them, whether it's via WhatsApp or having a Zoom call or something like that. It may become apparent that somebody isn't dealing as well as everybody else with it because of different issues they have. And maybe if that becomes apparent, follow up with a call to them, see if you can offer some kind of support to them. maybe refer them on to Inspire Wellbeing, which used to be Care Call, if you have those kind of concerns in relation to them. So our key here would be keeping in contact with your employees. Also, it needs to be made clear to employees that they are still working, and anything that they say in relation to their work on WhatsApp groups, on emails, is still covered under the bullying and harassment policies that are in place. So to make sure that nobody is undermining anybody's dignity in the workplace while they're communicating with other employees.
So all the essential obligations for employers still exist?
Still remain the same, whether or not they're in the school or working remotely.
And I don't know whether our participants had an opportunity to watch, but on last Monday night's main evening news, a school principal was interviewed about the whole question of reopening schools. And he discussed the whole logistical issue of having a lake of hand sanitizers, as you can imagine, if you've got anything from 500 to 1,000 pupils, wearing of masks and social distancing. And he was making the point out of, if you have a classroom with 24 students in it, you may, under current social distancing protocols, only have 8 there. And add into this, the social partners and indeed the management bodies were asked to submit their views on schools reopening by putting a submission into the Department of Education. I think the deadline was yesterday. So bearing that in mind, is it time, and what the Taoiseach said yesterday, that schools are one of the safest places to be, do you think we should start thinking, obviously in relation to reopening, and we have to await protocols on that, but should we be thinking, having a relook at our health and safety statement and risk assessment on that? Any views on that?
I think that's correct, David. I think, now and into the future over the next few months, boards, employers, as Catherine has said, their responsibility continues, and they need to be thinking about what are their responsibilities. So in terms of health and safety, everybody has a health and safety statement. Everybody has done risk assessments. Those need to be updated as situations change. So that would need to be updated for now, but also based on whatever guidance comes out of the Public Health Advisory team and from government and from the department in terms of doing a forward-looking risk assessment and then perhaps an update then to the health and safety statement for the autumn and whatever arrangements are going to be put in place. So now it would be a good time to start thinking about that and doing some long-range planning in relation to that.
Thanks for that, Paul. And just going back to a previous point that Catherine made about wellbeing and that, we in Mason Hayes and Curran 8 or 9 weeks ago, we were sent packing like you all when the schools closed. There are over 500 employees there. We do keep in touch by having these virtual coffee meetings. We've had the quiz, phone calls, etc. So it's something we really have to keep it in mind, keeping in touch and minding each other. I next want to move on to the question that is beginning to preoccupy people's minds, and this is online recruitment. And at the outset, I'd say, just to say that even though they're now working remotely, but prior to that, both Catherine and Paul would spend quite a little bit of their working time in the Workplace Relations Commission, defending boards and managements, as with other members of the team, against disgruntled employees and disappointed applicants for posts and that. That's at the back of your minds. I'm just wondering what you'd like to say in relation to the next question. And this is, we may have to embark on an online recruitment process or delay in the hope we can recruit with the traditional face-to-face social distancing included, but we risk not having a staff in place. Are we damned if we do and damned if we don't?
Well, I think it's up to each board to decide in relation to each position that they're interviewing for. There will be time constraints in relation to certain ones and maybe not in relation to others. The circulars allow for you to do online interviews, and those happen all the time. And we are awaiting a Department of Education guidance in relation to it. What I will say is that I'm not sure it would work for more senior positions, say for the principal post, deputy principal. And also there's an issue of would it go against an external candidate because the people involved in the interview may not know them as well. I think it's very much up to the boards themselves to decide and to wait and see what the guidance is from the Department of Health as well. Some people are deciding to do it via Zoom, and I know other boards are waiting to see if they can do it via socially distanced face-to-face. It very much depends. You would also have to be always aware of keeping records and documents in relation to, you know, the questions asked. The Employment Equality Acts will apply, so you need to be able to show that a proper interview was carried out, regardless of whether or not it's face-to-face or remote. There's also an issue in relation to recording, which I think maybe Paul might want to say something in relation to.
Yeah, I think there have been issues both in general meetings, particularly in interviews, where candidates have attempted to record interview meetings. And that's not any different when you're operating in a virtual environment. So I think it's important that the interview panel and the chairperson of the interview panel understands if you're going to conduct a video interview, what system am I using? Can I automatically prevent candidates from recording? Or does the system tell me if somebody attempts to record the interview? Having, of course, made it very clear to the candidate beforehand in your invitation to the interview that recording will not be permitted by either side. Because I think, as Catherine has said, we're very clear in the position in terms of notes and scoring sheets and the value of those in defending claims about interview processes for appointments or for promotions. We don't have any clear line of authority in terms of the use of video recordings of interviews, nor do we have any indication or comfort or safety in relation to where those recordings might end up. So I think it's important that we make it clear we're not going to use them. But also then we should give some thought to if the candidate does attempt to record or for some reason gets past whatever barriers we put in place and there is a recording, how are you going to deal with that in the context of the process? And that should be decided before it happened, before you embark on the process, so you're not kind of caught on the hop at the end of it and trying to make up your mind as to how you're going to treat this candidate now.
And I think also the interview panel would have to go through what it usually does as well in relation to meeting up, whether it's online or face to face, to agree the questions and the way that they normally would before an interview takes place. That's very important that they keep records of that also.
So no dilution of current procedures in relation to interviews and that seems to be the key message coming through. And thanks for that. We'll move on now to the next question. And I'm going to direct this to you, Catherine. It's in relation to child protection. And it says, how can schools be expected to fulfill a child protection role apart from acting on disclosures? What's your view on that?
Well, it would be similar to what in relation to employees. I mean, if a teacher feels that there's a concern in relation to a child, then they are obliged to report that to TUSLA. And then it's up to TUSLA to decide whether or not it meets the threshold. Children are under even more pressure now and they're more vulnerable because they're at home and teachers usually can pick up on those things. But I would say that if they have a concern, they should definitely refer it to TUSLA and see what TUSLA think of it. It is more difficult, but there are various ways that teachers are communicating with students during this time via Zoom, via email, and they may pick up on something.
And just looking at, Catherine, the child safeguarding statement, that's set in stone by the department and all boards and staff must sign up to it. But that's accompanied by a risk assessment. And the risk assessment is something that does change from time to time, depending on activities. So it's now a good time for boards and staff to look at the different or maybe increased risks that you have alluded to and to revise their risk assessment.
Absolutely, and I think Paul is going to be dealing later with how they set up the technology so they can guard against those kind of child protection concerns. So I think you would have to look at that. I mean, we have recently advised in relation to Zoom calls that have ended up with people in those Zoom calls that shouldn't have been on them. So I think you'd need to take that into account.
Okay, and thanks for that. Okay, we're going to move on, and we're going to come to technology in particular. And the next question is from, it says, I'm finding remote teaching challenging at times as teachers are using different platforms. Catherine referred to Zoom, and of course we have WebEx and GoToMeeting and other platforms. Everyone is working hard and doing their best. Should I be more prescriptive? And this is from a not so techie principal. So yeah, different members of staff have huge ICT skills, and that they're doing their own thing, and the principal possibly not in control because they don't have the skills or that. Paul, what's your advice to that principal?
Well, I can certainly sympathise, and I think we've all been on a very steep learning curve in the past 8 or 9 weeks in terms of technology. But I think, you know, it is incumbent on the principal to kind of get a handle on this for all sorts of reasons. You know, very pertinent one that we just discussed in terms of child protection, but also in terms of ensuring, you know, that the items of the curriculum that need to be covered are being covered, and we have a record of that to show it. So the ideal situation is that there is an agreed platform that the school is using, or platforms, depending on the type of learning. So if that's the type of video conferencing platform we're using, the websites that we're using, perhaps interactive teaching tools, that those are all discussed, you know, with staff, and that everybody is clear what the expectations are and what they're supposed to be using. And ideally then that is set out, if it isn't already set out or hasn't been contemplated in your acceptable use policy or your internet use policy, that you would look at that now and issue an update to that. And that's, even though we've been doing this for a number of weeks, it's not too late to get your hands around that and get that done now. The other important part of that, you know, and I think we've had examples of this, and certainly I've heard of queries in relation to this, is where if you don't have your laptops, your hardware, as well as your software up to date, if you haven't downloaded the latest security patch, or you haven't updated the app or the software you're using to the latest version, you can have difficulties. Things will not work, or you leave yourself vulnerable to people getting into your system. So that is also something that should be ensured. And then things like, are staff using approved school email addresses? You know, and this is for the benefit of both the school in terms of its visibility of what's being communicated, but also it's to the benefit of the teachers and staff in terms of that they know that it's within the school system, and it's not their personal email they're using, and they're not giving that out, or the communications are there to be seen. And obviously then to the benefit of the students themselves, that it's within an enclosed system. So I think, you know, the principal has to be happy and do his or her due diligence, that they're using agreed systems, that those systems are secure and up to date, and that they're being used properly. And then obviously that follows on then that if you do have some members of staff, including the principal, who may have you know, they may not be up to speed on some of these tech issues, that you look for training perhaps. I know, for example, in terms of using Zoom as an example, I know they are providing online training on their website. I think for users, or you might find other third-party providers, and that's something to consider as well, that you get people up to speed so they're using it efficiently and well.
Thanks for that, Paul. And of course, the PDST and technology are there to support schools too. So that particular principal could get support from that source. Okay, we're now going to move on to the issue of protecting the data that we have in schools. Given the advent of GDPR, one of the big features has been the huge increase in volume of data access requests. And Catherine and Paul, you know, this is very much, you know, a key part of work now, isn't it? In the office on a daily basis, these requests are coming in. And the question from this principle is, it's becoming increasingly obvious that we need to update our data protection and acceptable use policies. What should I be looking for? And in light of your experience of advising schools in relation to possible breaches and requests, have you any tips for our participants there?
Well, from a general point of view, you're right. We're still getting the requests in from employees and from parents. And even though the schools are closed, the time limits, GDPR time limits still apply. So it's 1 month. So I've been in contact with the office, the Data Protection Officer, Commissioner, in relation to extending the time. And they are quite understanding, but still we're advising that you need to engage with the requester as soon as possible to tell them there may be delays involved. Also in relation to secondary schools, you may need to get the consent of the student if they're over 14. This has come up a few times with us, particularly in relation to things like junior cert results. The child themselves will have to give consent to the information being given to the parent. So that's another thing that you need to think of. So I think you need to review your policy and have a look at it and see it, because there will be personal data of students that teachers now have on their own laptops and are dealing with from a remote point of view. So that should be looked at in relation to your policy. How is that stored? Security is going to be key here. Is it password protected? It's somebody else's personal data. So that's very, very important.
And Catherine, just to follow on from that, in light of what we mentioned at the start of the webinar, the alternative calculated grades that is now in place of the leaving certificate, and where you have the teacher who has to form an opinion of the grade and all the documentation that they must look at to come to that professional opinion. You then have a second layer, be it a group of subject teachers or year head or whoever, who are going to look at the grades which has been proposed by the teacher. And then you have the principal who must sign off on the process at the end. Would it be reasonable to say that a lot of students may be seeking, putting in a data access request in relation to the files?
Oh, they will be, that there's no doubt about that, and they will be entitled to that information. Not all of it, just information that is their personal data. But just people should be aware of that, and that they may make a request in time in relation to that information.
So in general, would you agree that anything we write down, personal sensitive information about any student, parent or teacher or whoever, that we write it down on the basis that they're looking over our shoulder or may be looking at it?
Absolutely.
Anytime. Okay, right. Thank you for that. We now move on to another piece, and this is in relation to the whole question of video conferencing and I'll direct this question, Paul, to you, if I may. And this question is, we are using, in their case, Zoom to great effect to aid teaching and learning in our school. However, we have heard some horror stories about Zoom bombing, and the teacher, I take it being the administrator, being locked out. Paul, have you come across any horror stories?
Certainly heard one or two, David, and I know Catherine mentioned one earlier on there as well, with a similar type of an issue with somebody coming into an ongoing class that wasn't supposed to be there. I think this goes to, kind of, it follows on from the themes we were talking about this afternoon in terms of understanding the technology you're using and the security features of it, making sure that your staff understand it, and then having agreed rules or protocols for your staff and for your students, so that everybody knows what's going to happen. So, for example, in the case of your teacher being dropped out or locked out of a live ongoing video class, that you understand, can I change the settings so that if that happens, if I as host drop out, does it automatically lock down the session? Or do you have somebody else, perhaps a principal or a deputy principal, on standby so that if you drop out, you can text them or WhatsApp them and say, look, you need to log in and bring that class to an end? Because you know, in terms of these live classes, all of the various rules that we would have in place, our code of behavior, our anti-bullying policy, they all continue in existence. They all continue to apply. So if you drop out of a class and something then happens when all the students are in there on their own, well, then there's an issue and you're going to have to deal with that. So you need to have clear protocols in place to deal with that. You also need to be concerned about where are you, and no more than the board management meetings we talked about earlier on. You know, am I in a room on my own, or are my family wandering around in the background? You know, can I be overheard? Do I have an appropriate background behind me? I don't have some, you know, strange, challenging piece of art that I happen to have in my home that mightn't be suitable as a background. And then if I'm sharing my screen, what am I sharing? And have I practiced that? And am I sharing what I intend to share? Or am I sharing something that perhaps I have my email program open and I'm showing off lots of persons' email addresses, or perhaps titles of emails that might refer to third-party individuals, perhaps students, perhaps other members of staff, that, you know, I don't intend to divulge, but I've inadvertently divulged now to whatever number of students are in my class. And then in terms of the behavior, you know, it's still a class. We wouldn't allow students to use their mobile phones or to otherwise, you know, surf the net while they're in class. So realistically, we should make it clear to them that's not acceptable in terms of the video class as well. And things like chat functions, you know, I did hear in the early days of these online classes, you know, certain things going on in chat functions to the side that maybe the teacher didn't have the window open on their screen so they couldn't see what was being said. And, you know, people were passing comment about each other or about the teacher in that chat function, and that created issues. So all of these things that you just need to be a little bit more aware of and a little bit tuned into, so that you can avoid then the potential legal difficulties that some of these things might cause if they're not attended to.
Thanks for that, Paul. And I noticed that Paul and Catherine don't have challenging pieces of art on their wall. And I have a harmless landscape there that you can't see either. So, but it's a very good point. So we move on to the next question, and this is in relation to emails and that. And just to say at the outset that schools and post-primary schools in particular use some excellent software packages like VSware. And I know that these are really useful, and the administrator or the principal can see, you know, in relation to a particular pupil that have concerns about the volume and the type of texts and emails from different members of staff. But the question here is, it relates to work emails. And it's a very simple question, and it says, can I as principal monitor work emails? So in taking the piece on emails and that, you might address that, please.
Well, I think the simple answer to that simple question is no. In the context of ongoing monitoring, that wouldn't be in line with the data protection legislation and GDPR. Now, that is not to say that if an issue arose that needed to be investigated, that it wouldn't be appropriate and proper for a principal to have access to a teacher's email to a student or to another staff member, for example. So on an ongoing basis, no, but on an incident by incident basis or in relation to a particular situation, you could have access to it. And I think that should be set out already. If it isn't, it should be set out in your acceptable use policy or your internet use policy for the school. But I think, you know, it demonstrates the importance, and we talked about this earlier, of coherence of systems, and that if people are using email now for remote teaching, that they're using an email that has been approved by the school, and they're not using their own personal email to communicate with students. Because of the difficulties that can give rise to then if you need to access those emails. I think the other piece, and you know, I would say probably more so in the secondary, post-primary sector, people are using perhaps online or video lessons, but there may be a large number of schools who are doing a lot of work through email, sending out assignments and getting them back. And I think it would be no harm for staff to have clear set of rules in relation to, you know, remind them of the type of communication they should be putting in emails. Emails are a tricky enough thing at the best of times. You know, they don't display tone. They can be taken and interpreted sometimes in the wrong way, and something that you might write with the best of intentions may be interpreted the other end in a very different way. So I think people need to be very careful, you know, without being overly kind of restrained. But I think they need to be careful in terms of what am I putting in here, and is it, you know, if I send this out to 30 people, are they all going to see the same thing? And then the data protection issues related to emails. We all know from our work in the office that, you know, emails are a fertile ground for data breaches and data protection issues. So a little bit of care and a little bit of caution. Am I sending this to the right person? Have I attached the right attachment? Did I hit reply all when I didn't intend to? Am I using the BCC function to send it to a list, but instead of using it properly, I'm now sending everybody else's email address, which is technically a data breach as well. So all of these things that, you know, we're now using email a lot more than we would have been previous to the COVID-19 situation. So I think we need to be a little bit more aware and alert to the issues that can arise from not using email properly that might give us cause for concern later if we don't set out clear rules now.
So thanks for that guidance, Paul, there. And it brings me to the final question there. And this is in relation to schools using the WhatsApp. And the question is, schools are using WhatsApp for staff communication. Is it a safe and secure way of doing business?
Well,
What's your take on that?
I think you need to draw the distinction between something being technologically safe and then something being legally safe. So I think, you know, WhatsApp will tell you, and I think it's generally understood that their system is end-to-end encrypted. It's how it's described. So if you're in a WhatsApp group and you send a text within that group, it only goes to the members within that group and it can't be accessed from outside. But the level of control you might have over that message is then within the hands of whomever is in that group. So it can be a screenshot can be taken of it, it can be forwarded. So I think in terms of dealing with sensitive issues, for example, if, as we talked about earlier, a teacher formed a concern about a student of a child protection nature, and they wanted to alert the principal in relation to that, or the DLP in relation to that, I would not suggest or recommend that that type of content be sent over WhatsApp or a similar texting type of program. I would suggest you might say, look, to send a text, I need to have a call with you, I need to speak with you, and then have a telephone call or some other form of communication, but not that level of communication in that type of way. I think that would be hazardous, to say the least.
So it is good, it has use, but it has limited use in relation to professional communications.
Yeah.
Good. At this stage, our webinar is drawing to a close, and I'd like to thank Catherine and Paul for their input and insights, which I hope you have found useful. All three of us are parents, and we have been the beneficiaries of the remote education. All our children are learning and are kept busy, so we want to thank you for that input. Just to say, if you feel that you have any issues or concerns you'd like to raise, please contact any of us on the screen there, or indeed any of the wider team that I referenced, Ian Reardon, Fiona Shield and Ian O'Herlihy. Ian will write to you, I send by email shortly with the slides and a recording of the webinar. And again, we'd like to sincerely thank you for your participation and to keep up the marvelous work that you're doing in what are momentous times and in the hectic weeks ahead. So thank you again, and above all, continue to keep safe.